the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the producer, songwriter and drummer. It's the one and only Merrick Hughes, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all that other groovy stuff. Worked on, or as part of Adam and the Ants during the very early 80s on Kings of the Wild Frontier and also Prince Charming, both as drummer and producer. Went on to work with Tears for Fears and then such artists as Robert Plant, Paul McCartney, Peter Gabriel, Enya and lots more. But anyway, you're going to find out much more about Chris in this interview. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was the early formative years. Chris, it's over to you.
Both my parents loved music and they both had a record collection. And I think my earliest memory of music being a happy thing, or potentially a happy thing, was watching my parents jiving round our front room. So it'd be jazz records, Charlie Parker or Bostic, Albert Ammons, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin,
Blimey,
Ella Fitzgerald. So, you know, I was very young and that was clearly their music, but it felt great. You know, I thought it was amazing stuff. And I think, so I was born in 1954. So by the time the Beatles landed in, say, my first awareness was in 1963, I would have been 9. And I saw the Beatles on black and white TV and was blown away. And then shortly after, the Stones and the Kinks and that early period of 60s British sort of guitar rock music, really.
Yes. And did you have any...
Obviously later, you know, people like Bowie and Mark Bolan, I mean, and Elton John, they were amazing. So the whole kind of British invasion, as we call it.
Well, you were there at the right time, really, weren't you, for that kind of experience? And did you have any older brothers or sisters that sometimes have a massive influence or interest, an uncle?
My best friend down the road, she had an elder brother who used to play me old rock and roll records and sort of Bill Haley and things like that. And he was, you know, he thought the Beatles were a little bit soft and not the real thing. They weren't really rock and roll. And so I was kind of amazed that he was dismissing this band I thought were amazing. But he was influential because he had sort of old, tougher sort of Eddie Cochran things. And, you know, I was aware of sort of Teddy Boy music and things like that, although I was actually too young for it myself.
Yes, absolutely. There's been quite a good book just come out really about Teddy Boys, hasn't there, by a guy called Max somebody, I can't remember his surname, but yes, it's an interesting world. So what was your first gig you went to? Was it in the sort of late 60s at this stage?
Let me think. I went to the Hyde Park gigs. I saw the Stones and I saw Blind Faith. So that was sort of 68, 69, 70 period. I saw Frank Zappa and the Mothers at the Albert Hall in June 69. So how old would I have been? 15? Yeah.
Yes. My God, you aimed for it, entered quite high at this stage, didn't you, really, at this point in life? So when you got...
I think I figured at that age I was going to be profoundly interested in music. So, yeah, I did quite a lot of research and had all the mags and, you know, got all the info and followed, you know. I mean, a lot of it was like a passing fad, like, you know, Jerry and the Pacemakers and, you know, Freddie and the Dreamers. And as a kid, I thought they were great, you know, but obviously my taste aged.
Yes, this is all very true. But then when you get to 16, which is going to be 1970, I'm doing the maths here. I mean, at this point, I know, Well done, me. Yeah, I mean, it must have been kind of also quite interesting, it being obsessed with music, but then sort of at that stage, music, modern music that had just almost been started, 63 roughly. Suddenly hearing the death of people like Brian Jones and then Hendrix, Joplin, Morrison, there's the
Yeah,
kind of the other side of the Summer of Love from 67 of,
yeah,
Manson and sort of Bad Acid and
yeah.
Speed Freaks. I mean, 16, how do you then sort of navigate that interest in next little decade when suddenly all those bands are either like the Beatles breaking up
Yeah.
and like,
I mean, if you look at the say the Beatles breaking up in 1970, late 69, 70, and you think about the amazing work they've done, you know, and when they're doing Abbey Road and they're working on things like Octopus's Garden, you've already had Cream and Hendrix and the Who and other bands waiting in the wings to be amazing. So it's sort of reasonable that the kind of slightly soft, slightly kind of corny side of the Beatles would in a way, give way to a lot of. I mean, I remember as a kid seeing Zeppelin at the Albert Hall, first week of 1970, and being mind blown just by how powerful, uh,
yes.
what a spectacle it was. And, I saw a lot of bands, that were playing really well live. I got to see. I saw Santana, quite a lot of bands.
Oh my God, you saw the rock gods, didn't you? Did you see
I've
the Yardbirds and
never saw them. Never saw the Yardbirds.
or Jeff Beck?
Seen Jeff Beck a couple of times. In fact, I saw Jeff Beck not long before. I saw him at the Albert Hall not long before he died. Yeah,
Blimey, that is
I
quite
mean
interesting.
Jeff Beck, peerless, absolutely peerless.
Yes, absolutely phenomenal. But then, when you got to 16, at this stage, did you leave school or did you go on to college, university?
I left school during my first year of A levels. So how old I was then?
17, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I had all these masters at school, being bossy and all the rest of it. And then I went on to FE College in Putney in South London and did pure and applied maths, physics, and art. And the level of tutoring and teaching was just so superior. It's like where I'd been being bossed around by some chemistry master. 6 months later, I was having a pint with Bill, the maths teacher. It's very, very different. You know,
Yes, good
so
old Bill.
yeah, God bless him. And so I did 2 or 3 years getting A levels at further ed college, and then somebody I knew from my school said, there may be a job for you in Notting Hill, Virgin Records. So I went along and got a job at Virgin Records, kind of as a sweeping up lad,
Yes.
doing packing records and central stock coordination. I worked for Richard for 3 years.
Blimey, you must have been
Yeah.
very excited by Tubular Bells.
Oh, we can talk a lot about Tubular Bells. Yeah. I'll tell you this now. I can remember being in the Notting Hill Gate shop on a Saturday. So I wasn't working behind the counter, but I knew everybody and I was hanging out and I'd pop in and hang for a bit. And one of the things which was phenomenal was that they put Tubular Bells on. No announcement, just put it on. And people would walk up to the counter going, "What's this? Oh, I've got to have a copy of this." Great. Yeah.
Yes.
And honestly, without any real promotion or without any real kind of story, people heard that record and thought, "This is amazing. This is different. I need this." And I watched that record sail out the shops. It was astounding. And it was just word of mouth. And it sort of grew from that. But I remember packing boxes and boxes of Tubular Bells off to all the shops, all the Virgin shops around Britain.
Yes.
It was
Well,
extraordinary.
it was because I had a brother who was 7 years older, and he kind of got himself into the world of prog rock, and I used to sneak into his room and listen to these prog rock records. Yes, Genesis, Wishbone Ash, the solo work of Rick Wakeman, but there were, obviously Tubular Bells was in there, and then sort of Deep Purple and Black Sabbath were just
Yeah,
stuck in there. It was a real cliche, and every vinyl record had that plastic cover that certain people would buy just to
yeah.
keep, to make sure their little brother didn't put any greasy finger marks on them. So But yeah, it was kind of quite amazing because obviously I've been forbidden to listen to these records. So hearing them in this kind of room, just going, my
Thoughts?
God, what is this? This is just
Yeah.
unbelievable.
I mean, that must have been amazing to be hearing effectively what must have seemed like contraband. I should be hearing this, but
Yes, I
you know,
can't tell him. I can't tell him I've been playing these records
yeah,
because, they were all hell to, would break
well,
out. And then,
I can remember hearing the first Black Sabbath album and thinking, "Oh my God, this is amazing." It was so direct. I just thought it was quite basic and really powerful and really good. Uh,
yes, well, God, amazing.
yeah,
The riffs,
there are a lot of bands I like. I mean, Pretty Things, SF Sorrow. That album was a sort of trippy kind of post Beatley type mad record. I really like that. And the album after that, Parachute by Pretty Things. Both of those albums are amazing.
yes. Well, I did. I love that. There was a series on TV called Classic Album Series, which I
Yeah,
I just adore, whatever the artist. and
yeah,
and the Black Sabbath one's fascinating because the musicians are so knowledgeable and have got so many influences that they came to, they'd be, oh,
yeah,
I listened to the Planets and I heard this riff and I played it, and then so and so played this bit and I had this jazz influence, and it was like,
yeah.
wow, there wasn't just, yeah, it was a complexity to their kind of
And
thinking.
it's always exciting when you find, say, you take a record or an artist you like or a record they made, and then you find out what their influences were.
Yes.
It's always amazing. You know, I mean, Brian Wilson. He talks about um, parts of writing and recording Holland, the album Holland, and he
Yes.
he was listening to Randy Newman's "Sail Away." While he was kind of in that headspace. And
You're right.
he wasn't stealing what Randy Newman was doing, but it was an influence.
Yeah,
I,
absolutely.
I always find it interesting when you find, um, this may be true, I'm not sure, but allegedly, the Rolling Stones, when they were doing Exile on Main Street, listened to Sailing Shoes by Little Feat, which is, you know, extraordinary. You know.
Yes.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
an interesting, yeah. So there's the Graham Parsons and that kind of
indeed, indeed.
influence and alt country almost, wasn't it, at that stage? God,
Very
I
much.
love that. Was such a gorgeous. So what you musically, I mean, it's quite an interesting period, isn't it? Because you had the singer-songwriters, that Californian sound, you
Yeah,
had sort of heavy metal, you had prog rock,
yeah,
you know, German music coming in, and then, that kind of the beginning of sort of punk,
yeah,
pub punk coming in with,
yeah,
Brinsley Schwartz and Dr.
yeah.
Feelgood. So how were you navigating those influences? Because that music used to be very tribal, wasn't it, at that stage,
No,
mostly?
it was, and I sort of steadfastly rejected the nature of, for me to like one thing or another. I mean, I remember as a kid, someone saying, "Well, it's got to be the Beatles or the Stones," and I was saying, "Well, they're both great. What are you on about?" So I was listening to and going to see, Nick Lowe, Brinsley Schwartz, a whole bunch of help yourself stuff,
Yes.
and I was going to see heavier, kind of more meat-headed rock. I enjoyed it all.
I wish.
Plus, I was really into electronic music and experimental music and Stockhouse and endless amounts of quite a wide range of music. You know,
Yes.
I consumed lots of it, and I felt lots of it was great, and it nothing seemed to be in conflict for me. You know.
God, I wished I had been that loose in the 80s. I was a bit uptight, really. But
Well,
then on my own.
I think there are moments in your life where you want to align yourself with a notion or a trend because it feels good at that moment. But for me, they were all quite short lived. I just enjoyed the music and moved around liking lots of different things.
Yes. So 74, you're then sort of hitting 20. You
Yeah,
probably finished college.
yeah.
What's your next period of of your early 20s?
I suppose that period I was, as I say, working at Virgin Records, and I was aware of a lot of music that was generally floating around. So bands like Gong, you know,
Yeah.
who were
Hawkwind?
Hawkwind. Notionally, I always liked the idea of Hawkwind, but I never really sat and listened to their records extensively. I mean, I'm aware of them to some degree, but there are other prog bands I like. Egg, for example, they were for me an astounding group. So I spent ages studying and listening to how their records were put together. And
Yeah.
all the while, um, I wanted to um, get into record production. I just thought I love the mechanics of this and what's going on, the layers of music, and where the temperature of this piece of music comes flying up out of nowhere into an emotional peak. I just, from an analytical point, I always thought, oh, this is amazing. I play records to my friends. Listen to the way this moves from here, and it drops into a minor key, and then it all goes quiet, and then it goes explosive again. And they're all going, yeah, yeah, yeah. So what? And I'm going, no, no, this is profoundly important. So,
Yes.
so I think I was always excited in the mechanics of it all, And so one of my first loves was to try and be a record producer.
Yeah. Had you
The-
started playing music at this stage?
I played piano, relatively, arranges piano quite badly, but I could play piano. But drums. So I had my first drum set when I was 13, and I used to play at home a lot, quite diligently. I had, high school bands, which amounted to nothing. But yeah, I knew my way around a drum kit. I understood the nature of it. So listening to records and, listening to the beat and, you know, where the beat changed and what happened at this point, enthusiastic study, really. So yeah,
Yes.
drumming and rhythm um, is a large part of my musical
Yes,
story.
absolutely. And were
Yeah.
there any particular drummers that had sort of influenced you? John Bonham.
You can't talk about drums without mentioning him. Yeah, let's go from the top. Ringo, probably
Yeah.
majorly important for me. Obviously, John Bonham. Um, Clem Catini. He's a phenomenal drummer, and he was still, probably still is, um, a session drummer working in London. And I'm not sure the exact number, but he's played on probably about 50 number one records, singles, pop records, and he was in the Tornadoes. He played for just about everybody, and he's a phenomenal drummer. And there's lots of records that I thought were not quite my thing, like for example, the Hermits
Yeah.
record didn't really appeal. But I'd listen to it, and think the jump on this track, the rhythm playing, the bass and drums are amazing. It happened the whole period of that sort of 60s pop thing. And I realized that they were all Clem Catini on drums.
Right.
So he's majorly important to me in terms of his whole approach to drums and drumming. If you
Yes.
if you look him up, on Wikipedia, you'll get an unbelievable list of things he played on.
Is he the is I don't think it's the same guy who played on what's it, 200 sort of hit singles, or I
Well, he
can't
might
remember.
well have done, but he's had about 50 of those hit singles were number ones.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is quite boggling. I have spoke to quite a lot of drummers over the years, and they're being quite traumatized by their experience of being a drummer. I think the pressure in the studio, especially going through that 80s and 90s period, was quite tough for a lot of them, and they didn't
Yeah.
make it to the end of the recording session, and
Yeah. Yeah.
ended up getting kicked out of the band and taking
Well, the drum
drugs. And
yeah, it's a volatile thing. There's I mean, having been and still am to some degree a drummer, the endless jokes about, who do drummers hang out with? Musicians, as if they're not treated as musicians. And there's a whole subset of drummers who are extremely fine musicians and know exactly what they're doing and understand the nature of song and chord progression and rhythm and, counterpoint, the whole bit. They're fully aware of what they're doing.
yes, but
It's not just someone who sits there tub thumping. You know,
well, I did an interview with Hunt Sales, and he's got an amazing background in jazz drumming, and he
Does.
played on some of the most iconic songs of the '70s and some of the '80s. And again,
Hunt Sales, he played on some early Todd Rundgren stuff,
yeah, that's right, him and his
and,
brother
and
Tony.
his playing's amazing. Yeah, so
Um,
yeah, he's a good one. Yeah,
and when you hear that intro to Lust for Life, you think, yeah,
yeah.
that's because of the drums.
Yeah.
It just comes in at that
Because
point. And a lot of other musicians have often said, the band didn't work because we didn't get a right drummer, or just finding the drummer, you know, you find the right drum and suddenly, okay, it's all working now. We're a proper band and we're going to have something's going to happen.
Yeah, it's pivotal. If it's rare you get a great group with a bad drummer.
Yes, probably impossible. There was a
Yeah,
great documentary, I don't know if you saw it, on the wedding present making that album, George Best. And
yeah,
there's a huge amount of problems with the drummer and the producer,
yeah,
and some sort of legal notice gets flashed up in the film. You go, oh, that was a bit weird.
yeah. I think drum wars. Yeah, it's. I mean, I've experienced it with bass wars as well, where um, members of the band who aren't the bass player have a sense of how the bass part should go. And I've seen that quite a few times with the bass player saying, "Well, I would do this. I think it should be that," and someone else saying, "No, I want it to do that." And you get this little place where the bassist wants to kind of do what he wants, and he's kind of probably more concerned about his approach than what might be the best approach for the song. And that's when you get into the whole psychology of what is everybody doing in a particular recording session.
Yes, you
Some
can
bands,
imagine.
some bands are amazingly cohesive and understand intuitively what they're all doing, and other bands, maybe some of them don't have the same way of thinking.
No,
That
this is,
happens, and
yes.
quite often in groups like that, you often find that two of the members are down the pub, whilst perhaps the others are struggling with how the recording is going. You know.
Yeah, there's some great moments with Sting and yeah, Mr. Copeland, isn't there? So having moments of two egos, or no, two people who have got very definite ideas of what to
Yeah, I
do.
mean, Copeland said many times that when the red light's on, he has to get his part right. Even though, after he's done his amazing drum take, the others can change the key and re-record everything and, you know, discover what they're doing as they're going along, whereas he's had to nail it and get it right straight off. And in a sense, he's right, you know, other than the
Yes.
other than the fact that if they'd discovered something past his drum playing, he could come back and redo it in a different way. But I wasn't there, I don't know. But he has commented on the fact that he felt a big pressure to be amazing at the point of red light.
Yes, amazing. It's
Yeah.
so as the 70s progressed on and we got to 77, 78, and sort of punk was very much happening and you're in London. How was that kind of influence in your next musical kind of period?
Well, I was aware and went to sort of quite a few proto gigs of, I suppose, earliest would have been 75, I think, 75, 76, where punk was cropping up in pubs effectively.
Yes.
Um, and, at a certain point it exploded and, the Pistols became, notorious overnight and that whole thing. I, I went up to Liverpool to um, try and produce my earliest attempt at produce. I was invited to come up to Liverpool and produce a group called Dalek I Love You.
Yes. Uh,
And
wa- was that part of Eric's and Bill Drummond's scene and Big in
very,
Japan?
very, yeah, there's a few people that were very important. Yes, indeed. Um, Copeland, Copey, um,
Julian.
Julian Cope was very important. Um, yeah, there's a bunch of people. Um, Nightmares and Wax. There was a bunch of guys hanging out. We recorded a couple of tunes, brought them back to London, and while I was waiting to play what I'd done to the A&R guy, I was in the waiting room. It was a bit like a dentist waiting room, and this guy says, "Oh, hi, what are you doing?" He was a very chatty guy called Ian Dragoning, very important man. He said, "What are you up to? What have you been doing?" We'd been chatting away for a while, and I said, "Oh, I've done some sort of electronic recordings at home with tape loops and bits and pieces. And I've just come back from Liverpool, having recorded some tracks by a band called Dalek I Love You. And I'm just about to have a meeting and play them." He said, "Oh, send me a tape of some stuff you've been up to. It'd be really good. There might be something we could work on."
Yes.
And I thought it was fantastically energetic. And, he didn't really know me, but I thought it was great. And so I sent him a tape. And then about 2 or 3 weeks later, he phoned me up and said, "Yeah, I listened to the tape. Really didn't like any of it, really, but I really found you interesting and fascinating, and quite a creative mind. Do you fancy coming up to the to my office, and I can play you some bits and pieces I've got on the go that may interest you?" So I went to see him, and in his office, and he had a little tape deck, and he played me some bits and pieces. And he said, "I've got some rough masters that aren't quite right. I wondered if there's anything you could do with them. There's no real money in it, but could you work on them?" And I thought, well, I could edit a couple of bits and repeat a couple of bits and chop a couple of bits out and maybe EQ it a bit better and do a very rudimentary job on it. I said, "Yeah, I'll have a go." I took the tapes home and I messed about at home, brought them back. And whilst I was playing what I'd done in cassette form to Ian, Adam Ant walked in and he said, "I don't know who you are, but you've been messing with my tapes. I don't know if you think you're any good, but if you do think you're any good, why don't you produce me? I'm ready to go. I've got Marco. Let's go. Let's record something."
Right.
Yeah,
My
and
God.
I know. So one minute I was kind of doing bits of Liverpool psych pop, mad electronic guitar strumming oddball music,
Yes.
which you couldn't describe as punk or any of the kind of anger. Um, and the next minute, Adam Ants walked in and said, "Well, who are you? What are you up to?" And back in the day, this would have been late 79, early 80.
Yes. That's
So,
quite. And had you had much experience of music production and tape
no,
loops?
no, I'd had loads of experience, what I call in the lab. I'd worked out how compressors worked and you know what EQ did, but it was rudimentary, no real practical experience. But a friend of mine had invited me up to Liverpool because he was kind of wanted to get in on the scene, and he thought it'd be better if we collaborated. So I went, "Yeah, sure," and I kind of asked the engineer 1,000 questions and made suggestions about how things could work, and maybe we could try that and put that mic in a bucket or whatever it was, and
Yes.
brought the tapes back, and they went very well. In fact, the two recordings we did actually got released as singles.
Yeah. Dalek, I Love You.
Indeed, yeah. So
And that
anyway,
was.
sorry,
Yes.
go on.
Yeah, and I think that came out on a label which was part of, was it Warner Music, wasn't it?
Um, well, the label that took it on was Phonogram.
Right. But
They
that
may have,
became,
they may have,
yeah.
they may have had the group indeed may have moved to Warner's. I'm not sure. I'm not,
Yes. It was
but
quite,
certainly
and did you meet people like Bill Drummond or David Bath and all that bunch?
yes. David Balfe, I know.
Yes.
Bill, I met. David Balfe, I did some recording with. We did a track from Monsoon. We did a Tomorrow Never Knows cover, which was,
Geez.
yeah, with a
So that was Sheila Chandri.
indeed, indeed.
Yeah, I did an interview with.
Balfi is a friend of friends of mine, and we move in similar circles. We don't see each other very often, but I regard Balfe as a great guy. Yeah.
Yeah, God, I know. I've done an interview with him. He's lovely. Did you sort of, how did you feel about that Liverpool kind of scene, or was it just quite so brief you didn't sort of get too much of a chance to indulge in Eric's?
I didn't indulge largely, but in time. I got to know quite a few of the people involved. One way or
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was just, I suppose it was kind of much more of an arts scene, wasn't it? You had that
yeah,
band called Deaf School, which and big in
yes,
Japan,
of
and
course,
and
yeah,
that kind of world. And I think
yeah.
they were probably a very concentrated, intense mix. And I remember Jane Casey said some comment like, "We wore our neurosis on stage," and that was probably quite a good way to describe the bunch of
I,
them. Who,
yeah, I think and also beautifully contrary in a lot of ways. You know,
yes, it's
I love, but there again, in a kind of Liverpool scene sense, I think that's a fantastic energy they have. You know,
yes.
yeah,
But
it's very
then
wonderful.
going back to London though,
Yeah,
because 79, there was the first band on 4AD Records, Rima Rima, wasn't there? I don't know if you come across,
of
because
course
and that
I have.
was
Yeah.
the
That was our
Marco.
man. That was our man, Mark. Yeah,
Marco was in it, and Dorothy, and
yeah.
various other members who went into 4AD music. Were you aware of people like Rima Rima at that stage? I mean, they only lasted 8 months.
That was the beautiful thing. There were lots of bands that lasted 10 minutes and did something profound and was great and had a sort of notoriety. So yeah, I was aware of um, Rima Rima. I actually think Ian gave me a copy. Or either Ian or Marco himself gave me a copy, but I have it somewhere here. Yeah.
Yes, there's a brilliant film that came out last year on them, which is just worth
Yeah.
checking out and
Yeah.
tracking down just for sort of amusement. So
Well,
when
I love the legendary status that they have, for such a short-lived moment. You know, most people who know about that period go, "Oh yeah, Rima, Rima, yeah, of course, amazing."
yes,
And early versions of Susie, which
yeah,
which Marco and Sid were hanging around doing, you know, Banshee type things.
yes, but
Yeah.
obviously, sort of Adam, sort of. So then you were just pulled into the band.
No, I was, but not just pulled in overnight, sort of thing. Um, So we went down to Rockfield to record Cartrouble and Kick, and I hadn't really discussed with them about the fact that I played drums. I don't even know if they knew. I just thought dealing with these guys and getting a great record, it would be a lot easier if we got a drummer of some renown to actually, so I could just kind of organise the three of them. So
Yes,
the John Moss Culture Club came down, and he was fantastic. Played beautifully. And yeah, we went down to Monmouth and came back with two recordings.
blimey, that's amazing. And
It
did
all,
you
it
enjoy?
was all very quick. The whole thing was amazingly quick.
Yes, things were moving very quick at that point, weren't they?
Yeah,
I think Marco was kind of looking at the next step after Rima Rima, wasn't he?
I think most certainly. And Marco, I think, was fantastic with Adam because Marco's got a fantastic pop sensibility. Not that Adam doesn't; they both do. But combined, they managed to get um, the more zany ideas of Adams into a kind of pop form, which was extraordinary. And
Yes.
I remember them very early days, coming round to my house, and they wanted to record a demo of Kings of the Wild Frontier, which we did in my bedroom. I mean, it was just extraordinary. And I thought these guys, they're fantastic. They're really intense. They really mean what they are trying to do.
Yeah, and it was an
Very, very
interesting.
impressive. So I didn't once again, I wasn't involved in being in their band. They were an entity, and I just assumed that they would get bass players and drummers and everything else. And then
Yeah,
at some point later, Adam said, "Oh, we've got a kind of audition in London. Can you come and maybe help pick some drummers and just can you come down?" So I went down and drummers sort of came and went. And by the end of the day, there was one guy, Terry, who became a member. And as we were leaving, Adam just said, "Oh, because I'd sat there and showed these drummers that were coming in, perhaps how they could approach something." And Adam said, "Oh, why don't you do it?" And it wasn't join. Would you like to join the band? It's why don't you do it? And I thought, wow, I had no thought about doing that. And I sort of went, yeah, okay. And,
yes,
and Adam said, "Tell you what, then I'll meet you in Kensington tomorrow. You need a haircut and you need to look a little bit more like how I want the ants to look." So, God bless him. He was very diligent and very prepared to make his gang look
yes,
look and seem a certain way. I mean, the great thing about him is he knows what he wants, and he doesn't really settle for anything less. You know, which is
yes.
which is an amazing quality. He is visionary and super energetic, and yeah, I owe him a lot in terms of him having any faith in me.
Yeah, and it's
But
quite
there
an
was also,
interesting. I was going to say it's quite an interesting period because 79, Thatcher gets in, so the
yeah,
political landscape changes quite drastically from the 70s of ever-changing prime ministers, and then we had the Falkland War and the miners' crisis and Greenham Common. So that moment in pop music where
Yeah.
suddenly you're number one must have felt quite strange of having such a shift into something so incredibly intense.
Yeah. I mean, I think any level of success when it comes, you're in the middle of it. You can only appreciate it on some level. When you look back at it, you think, wow, we did that, and that's what happened then, and then we met that person, and then we did that show, and then we flew off to Sweden to do a TV show, whatever it is. When you're in it, you're in a kind of bubble. You're just kind of doing what you can do. You don't really realize the level of success. I mean, you know that you're working hard and that things are going well, but you can't really sit back and go, "Oh, that's very successful. I'll take time off." In fact, we didn't, and I think Adam said, and I'd agree with him if we spoke about it. Had we had a bit of time off to recuperate, we would have probably carried on a lot longer. But
Yes.
but the group in that form just kind of burnt out, and I think fair enough. Adam wanted to do something else.
Yes, I think it's so tricky because it's like the stars have to line up if they do,
Yeah,
and when they do, you know, or yeah, I mean, it's going to happen or not. And if
yeah.
having 6 months off is great in one level, but then it probably never comes back, does it? So
I think it also depends how many years you've had before that 6 months, because there's so much muscle memory and ideology and way of working that you could take a few months off and come back and it'd be a refreshed version.
yes,
Whereas some bands just they're going to burn out because that's part of how they operate. They, c-
yes,
they come in as a supernova and fizzle out,
this
which
is
is
so.
fine.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of the way it's all seems to be. So, so with that the first album you did with Kings of the Wild Frontier, did you produce it as well?
Yes, yes,
Wow, that's so. How does that kind of work being in the band? Because I know with Motorhead, I think that by their third album as the classic trio, I mean, they had Fast Eddie trying to produce as well as
yeah.
play, and said it was not a good decision. They should have kept with the producer, but they'd fallen out with. So, so what was that like trying to organise this band?
Um, well, at times it was easy because at times the band were quite cohesive and kind of knew what we were doing, and it was fun. And other times it was stressful trying to get things to work a certain way, But we got through it. I mean, my memory of a lot of those was spending quite a lot of time getting the drums right and getting multi layers of drums to speak in a certain way. I remember doing all that, and I also remember spending quite a lot of time with Adam recording vocals, and working with him on what would be a good vocal take and an approach and all the rest of it. And he's
Yeah,
he's a very talented guy, so it was generally speaking quite an easy set of conversations.
yeah. And what was Rockfield like? Was that a nice experience being at Rockfield Studios and
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We were in the small bit. Yeah,
the cowshed?
yeah. We were in the beginners hut. Yeah, but it was great.
Yeah.
And Kingsley was there. He was fantastic, and you know it was good. And there's a huge culture with the whole Rockfield thing.
Yes.
And
And what's it? I mean, one of the things about great bands is always the rhythm section, whether it's Sly and Robbie or Fleetwood
yeah,
Mac or the Smiths, the Stones. How did you and Kevin Mooney? So, did that sort of come together quite smoothly?
it was easy. We drummed and he played bass. You know, it was quite straightforward. When it came to that live, that is, we rehearsed and it all made sense. We played live in the studio. Actually, there's quite a fair amount of bass that Adam played. He's a fine guitar player and he's a fine bass player, and some of the bass parts are quite obtuse and odd and strange, and they're his, and he played them. And you know, I don't think Kevin it's not that Kevin didn't have a say. It's I don't think Kevin minded. It was just what happened.
Yes, get the job done. There you
Yeah,
go.
yeah,
And and then sort of as with all great artists, there's that intensity. So the second album, or not the second album, but the follow album comes up almost immediately, doesn't it? At
yes.
that stage, was it just 24/7 with the band? And working
Yeah.
on the next project. And did the creative process change much at that point?
I think probably not the creative process, but the process of finishing that album was different because the album before had been successful. So you've got this added pressure of, people like that Kings album, and what do we do that's part of the same story but also inventive and new, and trying to get that balance and then make it feel like a sort of commercial record was quite hard.
Yes. And
I
the
mean,
videos.
well, the parts of it were great. I mean, Stand and Deliver, that was, um, I thought a great track, and it was played well. It had an expansive sense to it, and I really enjoyed making that record. Um, and Scorpio's, track on the album, I thought was great. But there are a few things on that I thought were quite slight, and they were nice, and I enjoyed doing them. But in terms of the vision, they were not as huge, you know. So
Yes.
for me, it's a kind of it's a little bit mix and match, that record. It doesn't have quite the same conceptual kind of strength.
Yes. But amazing clout. I mean, it was like people
Yeah,
don't forget that, like the Jam and Adam Ant at that stage were just like
yeah,
veering for the top spot, really, wasn't it? And
yeah,
selling millions of singles and
yeah.
just becoming the darlings. How
Yeah.
did you cope with that kind of
I loved it. I absolutely
excellent?
loved it. Yeah, I thought it was fun. I thought it was great. I mean, it was hard work. We had to pay attention. We had to try and learn how to dance. We we did we did all that stuff. We turned up and yeah, I loved it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then where do you go from there? What's your next move at that stage?
It was strange because I went for lunch with Adam and he said, "Look, just to let you know, I'm thinking of sort of changing things and not having, the ounce. But I'd still like you to, I'd still like us to work together and with Marco, but it won't be a touring ants thing. But it would be studio. It'd just be nice to keep doing some work." So I said, "Yeah, that's good." We worked on Goody Two Shoes, so that was a big track, which wasn't
Yes.
wasn't the ants, and the first of his, if you like, solo career, and which was fine. I enjoyed that, and you know, but then other things cropped up. The phone was ringing a lot, and people saying, "Oh, would you like to hear this?" Or perhaps you'd like to, maybe hang in and do a few tracks with this band. And it just was one of those things. It was a successful outfit, so because I was connected to it, people were asking me to do productions, and quite a lot of them were like second-rate ants type things, which I wasn't interested in. I was going to be doing that. I'd do that with the proper band. But at a certain point, somebody I know said, "Oh, there's a group that are sort of around. They've done a bit of recording that hasn't really gone super well. Would you be interested in meeting them?" So I said, "Yeah, sure." And I went down to Bath, which coincidentally is where I live now. I went down to Bath from London and met Kurt and Roland, Tears for Fears. They they'd done some recordings, but they hadn't done anything they really liked, and they wanted to meet me with a view to maybe doing some records.
Yes.
Yeah, I know. And I got off the train and met them, and they were super, super nice guys. I went round to Kurt's flat, and we sat around playing records and talking about music and all that sort of stuff. And they weren't actually sure that I'd been in the ants. They didn't really know about that, and they didn't ask. And it was one of those strange things where they said, "Yeah, we could work with him. That'd be good. We could do something." And I said, "Yeah, I like these guys. We could do something." And once again, it was super quick. We're in London, and we were booked into Brit Row Studios, and the first thing we recorded was Mad World.
Wow.
I know, we did it in just a handful of days, and a track called Memories Fade, which is off The Hurting.
Yes.
And so, yeah, Mad World, and we brought that back to the record company, and they went, "Wow, yeah, great, wow, oh, yeah." And before long, they said, "Wow, would you like to do an album?" So we did an album. So I did the Hurting, and it went from there. And then I did some things in the meantime. I did some Wan Chung and various other bits and pieces, and then I did the Tears for Fears second album,
Songs
song,
from songs from
song.
the big. God, that is quite extraordinary, isn't it? Because they do capture a certain zeitgeist, don't they, at that
Yeah.
stage? Were you producing them or playing on?
I produced both those albums. I played drums on both, bits of both. Yeah,
Yes.
and indeed I played drums on Sowing the Seeds album.
God, yeah, that is quite an amazing story, though.
Yeah,
Did you? I mean, with the '80s, production changes so much, doesn't it? And I
yeah,
noticed with certain artists who done some amazing stuff in the '70s, they really got lost in the '80s with some of their records. It
yeah,
seemed like they were following the trend,
yeah.
and but the bands who were on that zeitgeist moment managed to cope with the technology. And then you had that kind of, I suppose, where I was more of a indie pop kid, so that didn't embrace it so much. Did you
Yeah.
enjoy all the kind of studio kind of work that was happening during that stage?
Yes, I absolutely did. I loved it, and there were so many drum machines and sequencers and synthesizers, and the whole idea of learning what you were doing in public. So a lot of those records, they're just full of mistakes where the snare drum's far too loud because the bloke in the studio next to you, his snare drum was too loud as well, and it was a sort of trend or a style, or it was
Yes.
vogue. So we learnt about this particular drum box, and we messed around with it and thought that was quite good, and that became the basis of the drum part of a certain track. And sometimes it's quite obtuse, but we were growing up in public, really.
Yeah, it was a fascinating time, actually. I
Yeah,
mean,
quite
I
amazing.
must, I was kind of very much a John Peel type of person, so
Yeah,
I did enjoy that early hip hop dance stuff as well as the
yeah.
Bundy Boys and the indie pop scene of the Smiths and people like that as well. So
Right.
it was just kind of a kind of a very rich period. And then there was also that political side came in, things like Red Wedge,
Mm.
the Socialist Workers Party and all that kind of scene. So you had bands like the Redskins and obviously Billy Bragg and people like
Yeah.
that as well. So it was
Billy
kind of
Bragg. Billy Bragg's a very important guy for me.
yeah. I mean, it was just
Founding. Yeah.
kind of go into sort of the great Live Aid experience where I must admit, of all the performances, Adams is probably the one that didn't quite work really. But
Well, we could spend a moment talking about that. I think if you look at um, most of the acts that were there, I think they seemed, I could be wrong, but my impression was they were quite empathetic with the crowd and the general reason why they were there. And when you see Adam's performance, although he is trying hard to perform and he's trying hard to entertain, I wasn't sure that he was in mindset. I may be wrong, but my impression was he wasn't in mindset with what the nature of the concert was about. So I don't know whether that read through to the people, but I think his performance was generally um, wasn't well received, or didn't se-
no,
didn't seem to have a warm heart. But I don't condemn him for that. Just
no. Bizarrely, a friend got me a ticket, so I was at Live Aid and was very
amazing.
excited by vaguely excited,
Yeah.
to be honest. I thought, oh, the lineup's terrible. They should have got a much better lineup. But
Who would you have had there?
well, I was kind of going, "Where's Aswad?" I was a really uptight '80s kid, so I was like, "Oh, where's Aswad?"
Yeah,
They should be playing the Bundy Boys, the Smiths, Susan the Banshees. All these
yeah,
bands. You get gist to who I was in the '80s. So what Live Aid had were all the bands that I wasn't: Nick Kershaw, Sade, Phil Collins.
yeah.
It was the mainstream, wasn't it? And actually,
It,
Bob Geldof was right. Who he got was absolutely spot
yeah,
on.
it was Middle Britain. It
It was
was,
middle, yeah,
and that,
and
and Bob got that dead right.
yeah, I'm
In the sen-
amazing.
in the sense that it probably wasn't a celebration about those acts you're referring to, the Aswads and was, which would have been amazing, clearly. but it was about hard hitting, hit everybody who's kind of heard about anything, will kind of sort of know about Queen and a few things. And in that respect, Bob got it dead right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it was like we just need the crowd. We can't get clever here. We need
Yeah,
people.
yeah,
We'll hit Quo, and I grew up in the countryside in the 70s. Quo were the band,
yeah,
and the Quo fans were the most committed. And it's
yeah,
like they've got Quo to start it, but then it turns out to be Genius, and then
yeah.
all these other bands and Queen. You've got to remember Queen at the time were Norman No Mates. I mean, their career was totally over, and then suddenly they do this incredible performance, and they read it right, don't they? They
Oh, well,
absolutely.
I mean, if you watch their performance and you watch this moment where they know what they're doing is absolutely on point. And
Yes,
the way Fred commands the whole thing is exceptional, and I think everybody hit a moment of thinking, wow, this is actually a musical moment. I mean,
yes,
the event was the event, and the event was great, but the actual Queen moment, by the time they're doing Radio Gaga, Game, Set, and Match, just amazing.
yes. Career
Yeah.
back on.
Yeah.
Yes, Sun City, dearie me.
Yeah.
Never mind. There's always an own goal here and there, isn't there?
Oh,
So
always, you have to have your own goals along the way. You know,
it's how you learn from them, really.
oh,
That's the
I'll tell you this in terms of things I've learned along the way. More often than not, it's the painful errors that you go, I've learned from that,
yes. We
and
will
that's
be.
fine. That's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. So, no, completely agree on that one. So, as the 80s progressed, how did you then sort of navigate? Because you then work with Peter Gabriel on one of his albums, So, don't you?
Well, I knew Peter by um, dint of the fact that we lived in the same area, and so there's a sort of music community in Bath, and I got to meet Peter, and he asked me to have a little listen to a couple of pieces he was working on in his studio, and one of them was Sledgehammer, which was in its infancy,
Mm,
and another piece was Red Rain, and I came in to listen to Red Rain, and it was quite long and quite, if you like, sprawling, and sort of the sections were undefined. And I mean, if you like, that's classic Peter, where things are amazing at the very last moment, and they take a long time to develop and swap and change and move, and people come in and do bits and pieces, and the complexion of things changes. And I said, yeah, it kind of needs to have a rhythm structure or some kind of mapping of the rhythm for all the various parts. And I worked through and did some Lin drum, which is a very early programmable drum machine. I did a kind of program of how the drums could work throughout the track, which was kept, and it's in there in the mix.
wow,
So,
that
so
must have
that,
been amazing.
it was great, and he's a super guy to work with, you know. And I work. I've done various other bits and pieces. I did a piece for uh, there was a sort of Diana memorial double album. When she died, there were a lot of artists that gave a track for that, and I did a track with Peter.
Yes. Had
And
he, because there was that documentary, wasn't there, in the 80s where he was sampling, smashing a television and sort of putting it through some sequencer and
yeah,
making records. Was that early 80s or was that still
but
kind
I think because um, I can't give you Peter's exact chronology of things, but he was, a pioneer of the Fairlight, which is an early sampling machine. And he was, you know, going down to the city dump and hitting oil cans and scraping stones and sampling that and then slowing things down. And he's always experimented with sampled sound and loops and things like that and computer stuff, always.
yes, that's amazing actually.
Yeah, yeah.
He's quite, yeah, no, my brother had those first three solo albums, which I thought were like Shock the Monkey and
Doc
so
amazing. Yeah, amazing.
incredible. Yeah, he always had an amazing rhythm section, didn't he? Was it Tony Levin he had on,
Yeah.
which was quite incredible?
On bass and Chapman stick. Yeah.
God, yes, that was a
And
sound.
and a drummer of his for many years is Manu Katché is a phenomenal drummer, you know,
Yes.
inspirational drummer.
When you heard, just going back slightly to this probably 77, and was it Dennis Davis on David Bowie's Low album? Did you when you heard that kind of quality, that kind of flat but really hard sound, did you sort of sometimes think, God, how does he make some of those sounds?
Oh, from a child to now, I still do that. I still hear records and think, how have they set that up? What's happened? S- This isn't recording. This is alchemy. This is magical. I do that all the time. So there's always records. I'm thinking, wow, that sounds amazing. How have they done that? And sometimes you kind of have, from some level of experience, you can surmise it's probably this or that, you know. But in the case of hearing kind of room gated drums, so Phil Collins, you know, low, plenty of records, you think, I think I get what's going on. They've over compressed this, or they've overdriven this, or there's line distortion in the desk, or whatever it is. You kind of try and guess what's going on. And sometimes you can find out people that will tell you what happened if they were there.
Yes, it
I
must
mean,
be quite.
I remember listening to Spirit of Eden. The very first time I listened to that Talk record.
Yeah,
Waiting for the Colour of Spring, I absolutely adored and couldn't wait for Spirit of Eden. When it came, I listened to it and thought, amazing! I can't believe what they're doing here, how they're miking this up, and what level the amps are on, and what kind of guitar compression. Just the whole world of like, this isn't straightforward. I wonder how they've done this because it's magical. You know,
yes.
but
It's
there again, with things that you could say were more traditional, getting the mood on Kind of Blue, Miles Davis. That's not just setting up the mics. That's the kind of temperature of the thinking behind it, and how the guys playing it are going to approach it. Sometimes the psychology of performance is for me more exciting than whether the drums are like smashing too loud. I mean, obviously they're both important, but
yes.
it
There
depends
is.
which side of the brain you're working with.
Well, there is something, yes, I suppose, when you hear those comments like Captain Beefheart recording thick air or something, you think
Yeah,
there's something kind of magical that you
yeah.
kind of, yes, you
I mean,
wonder.
we could spend another interview talking about Beefheart and Trout Mouse Replica and those recordings.
Yes, dear old
That whole
Drumbo.
that, that whole mindset, is
Mhm.
extraordinary. You know.
Yes, John French. I did an interview with
Well,
him.
John French. Did you get on with him?
I did. He was lovely because they were bringing the Magic Band. They did a
Yeah,
really good, I don't know, possibly 10 years ago. They
yeah.
came and did a circuit and it was brilliant. And then they did it again. And I did two interviews, for each occasion. And he was really engaging. And he did say, and I said, what would you say to your 16-year-old self? He said, to have gone and played with Crosby, Stills and Nash, I would have been a richer person and less mentally disturbed.
Well, yeah, fantastic. I mean, he was incredibly important for me. His whole approach, amazing drumming. And
Yes.
I love Trout Mask, but some of his drumming on Strictly Personal, to me is amazing, just incredible. It's so inventive and not necessarily concerned about being rigid in terms of time, but having an immense control over feel. Amazing drumming. Yeah,
Yeah. It was, it was,
I've read various books about his time with the Magic Band, and it sounded like a pretty grim period of time, really.
yes, I think he was
Amazing,
a,
amazing music, but sometimes the music comes out of hideous pressure. But you know, no, he's
yes.
incredibly important.
Kind of controlled madness and creativity, really, wasn't it? I
And,
do. He
and,
has written, yes.
and intimidation. Too.
Oh God, yes. So as we got towards that latter part of the 80s, I mean,
Yeah,
suddenly, there was another shift. I always think music has a sort of a chapter of 3 to 5 years, popular music,
yeah,
and then bands start to go. The next wave of 16 to 18-year-olds want their kind of sound. There's a new producer, there's a new sound. I mean, then, we had Manchester, didn't we? We had the Chicago house sound, and then there was,
Yeah.
the Seattle scene. How do you sort of then navigate this new period?
I just did a lot of listening. You know, some yeah, Soundgarden, hugely important for me. I really enjoyed. You know, and where are we in terms of where they were doing what they were doing in Nirvana turning up? I've lost track.
Yes, well, that was kind of 89 was when Bleach came out. So there was,
Yeah,
I remember John
yeah,
Peel suddenly playing some stuff on Sub Pop 100 compilation, thinking, oh, this is quite an interest. And then at the same time, you had the Pixies throwing muses, but then
yeah,
we had, we had the Stone Roses and Happy Mondays, and there
sure.
was definitely a vibe there. And then we had the Orb. So there was all this kind of,
Yeah,
interest and ambient rave going on. So
yeah.
again, there was another kind of clash. But you were working with people like the Associates, weren't you? And then Enya
Oh,
came in.
yeah. Those things were quite brief. Um, I very much enjoyed working with Billy Mackenzie, but I didn't work with him for very long. We had a lovely time working, and it was a moment in time when we came together and did a recording, which was wonderful. In the case of Enya, which is another crazy moment, was that a friend of mine was basically producing her album, and he said, "Oh, you've got to come down to the studio and meet Enya." And I already knew her sister Moya from Clanad for a different sort of moment, but I came down and met Enya, and um, I agreed to play some drums on some hand drums and various bits and pieces on her record, which was lovely. A lovely vibe, very peaceful, very calm.
Blimey, that must
Yeah,
have been,
very, very different, you know.
yeah. And what was that like, working with an artist who just has that influence and can sell millions of records on
But
every.
I think, I think she just seemed incredibly calm and, very happy for people to come and meet her and maybe suggest something and play something, and she'd like bits. And um, yeah, it was very, very unpressured. It was just a very musical, very flowy kind of. Yeah, that's nice. We could try that, and you know,
Yes.
it was an absolute joy.
God, I would imagine yeah, it's just, you think, well, this is something that you can look back and think,
Yeah,
yes, I quite enjoyed doing that. And
yeah,
then
well,
as sort of we trucked into the 90s,
yeah.
then you work with Tori, there's Tori Amos as well, isn't
Well,
there?
that was another one-off thing where there was a track that I think needed to be finished or wasn't quite right, or I don't remember exactly what wasn't right. But once again, the guy that was there was Ian Stanley who was producing a couple of pieces, and he said, "Can you come down and you know see what you can do? That something isn't quite right." And so I came down and listened to the rhythm of a couple of pieces, and I played some drums, and that was it. I kind of did a bit of something, did some drums, and then Ian finished it off. So that was very enjoyable. It was just like, well, put your mind to what's wrong with this track and try and get a rhythm track that might work.
Yes, that was China,
That's,
wasn't it?
yeah, it's quite simple, quite straightforward. It wasn't like days and days of worry or concern. It was a moment that was quite fluent, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And then in the 90s, do you start sort of doing your solo work at this stage?
So I had spent some time living in New York, and I'd always been a huge Steve Reich fan, massive fan. Um, I'd seen his performance of drumming in London um, back in like 1972, which was profoundly important for me. Anyway, fast forward, I got a chance to meet him and play him some demos of some pieces of his that I'd rearranged and done in a computer kind of method. And I played in various bits and pieces. And then I said, and I've done a set of variations based on a couple of your compositions. I played him that. And he said, "Oh no, this is much more interesting. Yeah, come, come." And he took me into the back room and he showed me all his marimbas and bits and pieces of hanging. He said, you need to hear this and you need to know about this and here, take this." And it was an artist-proof fanfold of the entire score for drumming. He said, "Go away and have a look at that."
Blimey.
I know. So I came back to London, and then at a certain point started working uh, on a Fairlight originally, um, in the sort of MCL programming language, and programmed up some Reich pieces, and it kind of went from there. And then by '94, I'd finished an album called Shift, which is most of the compositions are based around his work.
My God, that must have been an amazing experience.
Oh, it's great. I had my own studio at the time, and I just worked on it when I could. And one of the pieces, which is a piece called Slow Motion Blackbird, has been well received. That's been, a lot of people like that track, and it's been on Radio 3 a fair amount of times, and you know, it's had nearly 1 million plays, which I know is laughable in terms of these days of millions and billions of plays. But for me, I was quite pleased with that.
Oh God, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so and that was enjoyable. And then in 2017, I did another record because I was in the mood to do some of my own music. So I did it in this very room.
God, that's
Yeah,
fantastic. That
and
must have been such
that
an experience. So
yeah.
then, and during that, obviously, those projects, do you then just keep getting kind of offers of working for different bands? Like you work for people like you did, was there some work with Lloyd Cole, Robert
Well,
Plant?
yeah, a band called Gene as well.
Yes, I remember seeing them at the waterfront, and
Yeah, yeah,
they had a very good moment, didn't they?
they did. They were a good band. I really liked them. Um, I don't know. I mean, some bands are more troubled than others, and perhaps they were a bit troubled. I don't know, but it didn't seem like it had a longevity. But nevertheless, I did an album with them, which I really, really enjoyed. Um, yeah, Martin's a talented guy, good writer.
Yes.
Um, yeah, that was fun. Uh, Robert Plant, um, I met him, and we agreed we'd do an album. So I produced the Fate of Nations album, which was done largely in London. But,
Because actually, he was one of those artists that I thought, a bit like Bowie, his 80s work and Rod Stewart as well, um, it all seemed a little bit like, oh, that's not. That's I know Let's Dance is good, but some of it is a little bit dated. But
yeah,
he gets
I,
himself back together a bit for the next period, don't they?
I've always quite liked artists that have been um, visionary or inventive and had a struggle and then an amazing period of incredible work. And then the period after that where they're still um, diligent, they're still working hard, but it's not quite in step with what's going on, or it's not um, in the vanguard of what's going on. And so you get, various Bowie albums. And there's lots of artists where they're in a period where they're working and it's okay. It's not their best work. And then they hit maybe another period where it's phenomenal. And you can map, there's a lot of people like Elton John. He's made some phenomenal albums and made some records which are okay, not quite as vital. Bowie certainly, you know. I think
I think
that's I think that's fine.
I,
Take Eric Clapton. He's made some phenomenal records and other records where it's not quite in step with what's going on, and perhaps it's not quite as important. And other records that cut through, and you think, oh yeah, that's amazing. So I quite like artists that are around for a long time to have periods where their records are maybe a bit more introspective, or they're not quite sure what they're doing. I don't mind that. The
yes.
fragility of getting things wrong when you're that famous, where there's an expectation to be amazing. I quite like. I think I find it quite brave on some level.
Well, I think I always thought of Tin Machine as that kind of moment of
Yeah,
somebody just thinking, I just need to do something. I just need to
yeah,
to shift gear. I'm going to do
Yeah,
something
no,
complete. I'm not
when,
going to overthink it. I'll get it. It'll get something out of the system. It will change the environment, and then
exactly right.
and it will change again. And I remember many years ago, sort of being very interested in sustainable living and seeing this guy in America who did something called Earth Ships. It's how to live off grid using tires and cans and glass and stuff like that, and using solar and collective water. And he was an interesting guy called Michael Reynolds. And I remember him saying he kind of wanted the freedom to fail because every time he failed, he would then think, right, next time I build one of these, I'll tweak it and I'll get better, and then it will get better, and then I'll have it. But I can't get it right the first time. And I think when you're an artist, you probably have the same experience. You think, I just need to finish this project, even if it's probably not going to be my best work. But the next one, I'll know I know what I don't want to do because
Yeah,
I've done it.
I
So,
think a lot of strong artists fail in public, and I think that's laudable. I
yes.
haven't got a problem with that at all. Talking of Tin Machine, I was one of the people saying, no, no, have another listen to Tin Machine. It's not great, but something's going on. There's an endeavour there. It's worth it. Before you just go, oh, Tin Machine, one of Bowie's errors. Wrong. It wasn't one of Bowie's most successful things, but there's some merit in that.
Oh yes, I love that.
Yeah,
I done an interview with Kevin Armstrong, as well as Tony and Hunt, individually, and I think those guys had a really good time, and I thought the music was quite vital. I mean, it was certainly better than the two previous solo albums,
yeah,
and they would have loved the project to have continued, probably for lots of reasons. But I like the kind of the snappiness. I like Bowie when he could just be snappy as well as
yeah,
and as Brian Eno once said when he was recorded with Bowie, he's like, no one's going to die doing this, David, so let's not overthink it. And I think that's important. You're not a surgeon, are you? You
yeah,
are just, you're going to have a go. And I always remember that Charles Shaar Murray's review of Low, which was very damning, and he must have thought, oh no, you
yeah.
know. At the time, we hated it, but now it's hailed as the glorious album. So there
Yeah.
you have it. It's
But there's
it's
a
one.
but the history of albums that had a bit of a sorry review day one that have then been held as incredibly. I mean, I can remember Plastic Ono Band album. Uh, People saying, "Oh, this is dreadful." It's got none of the class of a Beatles record. What the hell's he on about? But it's actually incredibly important and amazing. So one could be retrospective and go, "Oh, yeah,
Yes. And can you remember, like with the doing the Robert Plant album, did you drum on If I Were a Carpenter? Was that
I
one of the
did, I did." I drummed on two tracks. I drummed on that, and I drummed on a track called 29 Palms. Um, Both, very exciting and fantastic to drum on. Yeah,
amazing songs? God, I love
yeah,
those songs. They are so classic.
they are,
And
they are. You know,
but
and
one of our other
really,
kind
Robert, not the last time I spoke to him, but a while ago I spoke to him, and he said, "You know, um, I really liked what you did on If I Were a Carpenter," and I said, "Did you like how it got produced?" He went, "No, no, I liked what you did on the drums." So it was nice of him to comment on the fact that he'd obviously thought back or listened to it recently at the time and thought my drumming was nice on that.
yes, that was
Nice.
a nice.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So
one
that's been validated by the man himself.
yes, I know. He's yeah. I always remember one of his great interviews, which I saw a few, and sort of after the band had finished, and I don't know, I think there was a death as well. He said that was the end of innocence. That was that kind of 70s period was very over, and him as that kind of rock god was very over. And
Yeah,
I also it was quite a moment when he said that was the end of innocence, because up to then it had just been a blur, hadn't it, of
yeah.
rock goddom. So
I mean,
interesting.
yeah. I mean, the notion of rock goddom's mad anyway, on some level. But if we're going to discuss rock gods, he was one of them. I mean, as I say, as a kid, I saw Zeppelin. You know, Albert Hall, fifth row back. I watched them rage. It was profoundly powerful.
Wow, that must have been incredible. Yes. And then so as the 90s is kind of, we're in sort of new Labour territory. Gay Dad appears, doesn't he, with a very energetic Cliff,
Yeah.
who's such a nice guy. What was it
Yeah.
like working on a project like that?
It was mixed. The reason I say that straight off the bat was that the album, before it got going, was in a state of turmoil. They'd started with Tony Visconti, and I don't quite know what happened, but the track never sort of really got kind of finished. And I was asked to sort of try and make that make sense and finish it off. And that was my memory of it. And then I was invited to do um, the rest of the album. I met Cliff on a couple of occasions, and we hung out and chatted about how it could be and what it might be. And Cliff's a super bright guy, very inventive, very creative, and very kind of eclectic. One minute he kind of likes that, the next minute, no, it's this. And he has kind of um, these moments of clarity and these moments of deliberate sort of vagueness, and it could be on an impressionistic level, any number of things. And some of the tracks we worked on were quite difficult in terms of getting the nature of how the track should be, and then getting the performances. And he was quite a taskmaster. He was quite hard. I felt he was quite hard on his group and kind of expected them to be great, and kind of wanted to get on to the next bit, which would have been him doing guitar overdubs or him singing. Um, I'm not damning him behind his back. If he was here now, I'd be able to have that conversation with him. And in fact, I see him because for a while he lived in the same village.
Yes.
Um, but bits of it were very rewarding and really enjoyable, and the results are great. And bits of it I found uphill and tough. Um,
Yeah.
and that's how it was. And I think he hit a place before the record was sort of finished and arguably successful or not. I think he reached a place in his mind where he was very successful, and it became harder and harder to sort of rationalize what we were doing and say, Cliff, calm down a minute. Could it be this? Should we be doing that? And he went off. Uh, so Mark Frith, who was um, the engineer I met early days on the Baghdad record, he'd been working with Cliff trying to make demos and make things make sense for some time. And he was a godsend because he was so familiar with what they were trying to do. And in fact, I work with him regularly. He's been a kind of partner for the last sort of 20 odd years. And he had great insight into what Gay Dad were about. And in fact, when they finished the album and started album two, Mark Frith worked with him and gave up, walked away from the project because it was something just Cliff became sort of unproducible on some level for whatever
Right.
reason. I could sit and ask him now, and he'd be able to eruditely explain that. But you know, it just
Yes.
it became less and less easy to produce, which is fair enough. Some people don't don't want to be produced. That's
Yes. And then, sort of a bit later on, you do another solo album, don't you, at this stage?
oh, that's a that's a lot later. My second solo album I started in 2016, so that's a bit later.
Yes.
But also, there are other things, other bits of life got in the way. I mean, I was married, I had children, I've got three um, adult children, and I spent some of the time just doing dad type stuff and not actually in the studio the whole time. So
Yeah.
there's pockets where I'm doing less, and I've kind of never lost interest, but other things were, you know, more important.
Were you able to then pick and choose what you wanted to do at this
Yeah, I mean,
stage?
yeah, people have, yeah, thankfully, people have basically contacted me and said, "Oh, I've got some tracks. Can I play you this? What do you think of this?" And luckily, I've been able to sort of say, "Well, I don't really want to be doing any of this at this point, and maybe I could look at a few tracks here." And so I've been much more sort of reluctant to go into full album projects.
Yes, blimey, that's amazing. And has there been, still sort of work that you keep getting offered all the time, and you can.
Yeah, I mean, people do ask me to do things all the time, but You know, but I mean, for example, I'm part of a team that does a production sort of boot camp at Real World at Peter's Place. We do that like 3 times a year, and that's a sort of long weekend where we do a kind of, you know, so about 30 people turn up with musical ideas and kind of want their tracks. They want help with production and learn some of the techniques or some of the kind of methods and ideas on how production might be. And I find that actually really rewarding. Um, Having, being in contact with people that are kind of not necessarily at the first stages, but have come to a kind of group thing to try and learn. And
Yes.
I found that on an educational level, I found that to be, I've really enjoyed it. You know,
Nice.
yeah,
And
it
uh,
is. Nice.
probably, I don't know if it was this year or last year, I did an interview with is it Alexander Hackey, who's got a new album. Did you work with him and his partner at one stage as well?
I don't know. Doesn't ring a bell. So
He was
uh,
in Strassen Barton. I always mispronounce that. Probably
I don't.
not.
Yeah, I know the group, but no, I didn't. Not
No.
if I did, it was inadvertent. I wasn't aware that I was working with him. No.
Yeah. And did you sort of, I mean, people like Enya, you got here, you worked on drums and percussion. Was that another project that you got picked up and did again?
No, no, I only worked with Enya on one project occasion.
Yes. So do
I
you have
worked
your
I
own?
worked with um, Ross Cullum on an album for Moya, who's Enya's sister, and I did an album, sort of exec production kind of thing for her album, which is a beautiful record. But it's one of those things. Clannad are a fine group.
Well, yes, we have very fond memories of them.
Yeah,
So have you got your own studio at your place here at the
yeah,
moment?
yeah. So I live just outside of Bath, and I have a studio in one of the buildings in the garden. Yeah.
Blimey, that is very nice, actually.
It is.
And what projects have you got on at the moment?
Um, well, Lloyd Cole's last record, he came over and we did, because obviously he lives in America. He came over and stayed, and we did um, some vocal recording and mixing and production work on his last record. Um, and at the moment, I'm working on 2 albums. I'm working on the second Crybaby album, um, which I'm really enjoying. That's Crybaby is the kind of entity, but the man behind it is a guy called Danny Coughlin, who's a profoundly talented guy, great
Yeah.
song. So his record's like maybe 3/4 finished, and then a Welsh band called CVC, who are just fantastic guys to work with. They're a 6-piece band from Cardiff, and I've been working on their album on and off and looking at song doctoring and generally sort of getting to know them for about a year. And we've kind of recorded enough material for 2 albums, and we're at the tail end of all of that. And within the next month or so, it'll all be finished, and then we'll work out which tracks get used for which album. But that's a project I've been, um, when I started it, I said, look, I'll probably just, you know, sit at the back and not get on, not do much shop floor and not really get to the cold face. I'll just kind of say, yeah, that could be good, be quite sort of casual about it and sort of come and go. But actually, that hasn't happened at all. I've been there the entire time, getting on the shop floor and getting in amongst all the nuts and bolts and trying to get things to work in a certain way. And it's been highly enjoyable. I mean, tiring at times, but highly enjoyable. And that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Blimey, that's an incredibly busy life you've got there, isn't it?
Well, I thought at my age, I thought, well, perhaps I should just retire, but I can't imagine retiring. I just can't want to keep doing what I do, to various degrees. I just love it.
Yes. Well, I guess it's always the magic of music, isn't it? It is just, I know it's
That's
a
not,
bit.
yeah, that's not going to go away. I'm just going to always love noodling with music.
I think everybody, yes, everybody I speak to just has that kind of, well. while I'm breathing, it's not gonna. I'm not going to do anything else. That's the only thing I've learned. I mean, if you could have, if you could have whispered something to your 16-year-old self in 1970, would there be anything in particular you thought, oh, that would have been a really good idea to have done, or not to have done?
Yeah. Um, well, several things. I mean, the quiet word to myself would have been, "Don't worry, mate. It'll come good. Just keep going. Have a bit of. You need a bit more confidence and a bit more shove, but basically stick with it. It'll be fine."
Yes.
That's a very personal, kind of intimate chat with myself. You know, the more kind of um, catchphrasy kind of public word I'd have had was be an architect. That's what I would have done. Be an architect, and I say that because it's rather like the kind of the tradition of fathers saying, "Well, son, you need a trade to fall back on. This music stuff's never going to see
Yes.
you right." And so the kind of jokey thing would have been, yeah, be an architect. And the reason I say architect is because actually I love architecture, and as I say, I studied maths and physics, and probably if I hadn't, if music hadn't have turned up in such a profound way, I might well have gone along the lines of being an architect. But who knows?
Yes.
Who knows? Something else could have popped up.
And do you have any plans for your third solo album?
Yes, I can tell you a little bit about my next project. Is actually two records. One is a complete set of pieces I've done using modular synthetics, so it's modular synths,
Yeah.
and some modular synths soft versions, so um, VCV rack, various pieces like that. So I've got a trunk load of pieces of music, and visiting them and editing and preparing them for a release, I've virtually finished. So the first record is just me wrestling with sequences and calculated music, if you like. And then and the other record is um, more of a kind of a jazz record where um, there's a handful of musicians which I want to invite to come and play, and I'll sort of conduct and put some electronica in there, and I'll be doing some drumming. So one's a kind of a jazz. I wouldn't say modern jazz, but it's like electronica
Yeah.
jazz, um, or probably quite, yeah, not very easy listening, but should be worth listening to. So those two projects, they should be finished and available at least by the end of the year.
Blimey, that's fantastic. Do you have a label for them, or you?
Both of those will come out on Helium, which is a very very small label I've got, um, centered in Bath. Yeah,
God, that's fantastic.
yeah. So that'll be fun. I'm looking forward to that.
It'd be nice to, yes, have that kind of deadline to work towards the end of the year. There you go.
Yes, and I'm glad the fact that you used the word deadline, because I have to apply deadline. Otherwise, I'll be dead before I've done them.
I know it wouldn't be good. It'd be nice to see.
It'd be nice to finish them off. Yeah.
It would be nice. But look, Chris, thank you ever so much for your time. This has been
David,
amazing.
David, I have to say, it's been very, very enjoyable meeting you and chatting to you. Yeah.
And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview. A massive thank you to Chris for giving me the time for that. I will put his website in the notes below. This has been the C86 Show. David Eastaugh, if you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do C86 Show. All these interviews have been archived. Aren't you lucky? So you can find those on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Have a great week. Stay safe.